So let's talk about something that affects over 1.5 billion people across 54 countries, yet somehow gets reduced to a handful of tired stereotypes and misleading images. I'm talking about how media, Western media in particular, but really global media more broadly, has constructed and continues to perpetuate a fundamentally distorted image of Africa and Africans. Before we dive in, I need to acknowledge that this is a vast, complex topic, intersecting with colonialism, economics, power structures, and deeply embedded cultural assumptions. What I'm offering isn't comprehensive. That would require volumes, but rather an exploration of persistent patterns I've identified through research and analysis. This is one perspective, informed by scholarship, but ultimately a starting point for a much larger conversation. And I genuinely hope many of you will add your own perspectives and experiences in the comments, because this is very much a conversation that needs multiple voices. Here's what we're examining today. Media misconceptions about Africa aren't random errors or innocent oversights. They form coherent patterns tracing back to specific historical moments and serving particular contemporary purposes. We're going to look at how these fall into distinct categories: geographic and political misunderstandings, poverty porn and white savior narratives, cultural stereotypes rooted in colonial ideology, wildlife obsession, technology myths, and structural media bias. And critically, we'll explore why these patterns persist, what functions they serve, and how they interconnect to create what Nigerian novelist Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie has called the danger of a single story. The central argument: Africa's misrepresentation in global media isn't about factual errors fixable with better fact-checking. It's about a fundamental framework, a way of seeing, or more accurately, a way of not seeing, that was constructed during the colonial era and remains remarkably resilient even as formal colonialism ended. This framework justifies certain economic relationships, makes particular policy approaches seem natural and inevitable, and perhaps most insidiously, allows those of us consuming this media to feel a certain way about ourselves and our place in the world. So, let's begin. Let me start with what I consider the most basic, most foundational misconception, one that underlies almost everything else we're going to discuss. It's the treatment of Africa as a single, homogeneous entity rather than what it is: a continent of 54 countries, 1.5 billion people, and over 2,000 languages. Africa's landmass is larger than China, the United States, India, Japan, and all of Europe combined. Yet it's routinely treated as a single, undifferentiated unit. In 2006, President George W. Bush said, "Africa is a nation that suffers from terrible disease." A nation, not a continent with multiple nations, but a single nation. While his gaffe became a punchline, the underlying assumption it revealed is everywhere in media coverage. Look at headline construction. When there's an attack in France, we get "Terror strikes Paris" or "Attack in France." Political instability in Poland yields "Crisis in Poland" or "Warsaw in turmoil." The reporting provides specific geographic and political context. But when something happens in an African country, headlines read "Crisis hits Africa" or "Violence erupts in Africa." The entire continent becomes the relevant unit of analysis. Researchers comparing media coverage found that in the same sentence, news articles would list India, Poland, Germany, Africa, treating Africa as equivalent to individual nation-states rather than containing 54 of them. This isn't just sloppy writing. It reflects a deeper cognitive framework where African countries don't register as distinct political entities deserving of the same specificity automatically granted to European or North American nations. The consequences are significant. When we treat Africa as a single entity, we make it impossible to understand what's actually happening in specific places. Nigeria, with 200 million people, 500+ languages, a film industry producing more movies annually than Hollywood, and Africa's largest economy, gets lumped with Lesotho, a constitutional monarchy of 2 million people. Kenya, with its thriving tech sector, gets treated as interchangeable with countries facing entirely different challenges. This would be like treating all of Europe as one undifferentiated mass, discussing European problems as if they were identical from Norway to Greece, from Portugal to Ukraine. We'd immediately recognize that as absurd, yet it's the standard framework applied to Africa. This homogenization traces directly to colonial mapping and administration. European powers divided the continent into territories based on their own strategic interests, rather than existing political, ethnic, or cultural boundaries. Colonial administrators needed to simplify African societies to make them governable, so they imposed artificial categories and treated vast regions as administratively uniform. The media inherited this colonial framework and never fully dismantled it. News organizations still approach Africa with the assumption that it can be covered as a region in ways that Asia or Europe simply aren't. Major outlets maintain Africa correspondents, expected to cover the entire continent from a single bureau. No outlet has one Europe correspondent covering Iceland to Greece, yet that's standard for Africa coverage. This matters because it shapes policy. Western governments and international institutions design one-size-fits-all Africa strategies instead of country-specific approaches. Complex situations get explained through simple narratives about African problems, tribal conflicts, endemic corruption, as if these were continental characteristics rather than specific situations with specific causes requiring specific analysis. Beyond geography, there's the tribal problem. When ethnic tensions occur in Belgium, Bosnia, or Spain, we use words like ethnic, nationalist, or sectarian. We recognize these as modern political disputes with contemporary causes. For Africa, media use tribal, a word carrying connotations of primitive, irrational, ancient, and violent. This terminology has colonial roots. European administrators applied tribe inconsistently to simplify complex societies for governance. The BBC has largely moved away from using tribal in their style guide, recognizing it as inappropriate and misleading. But most Western media outlets continue using it routinely, activating a constellation of primitivizing assumptions. Consider Rwanda. The 1994 genocide is often framed as ancient tribal hatred between Hutus and Tutsis. But historians tell a different story. The rigid ethnic categories were largely created and hardened by Belgian colonial rule. Before colonization, these were relatively fluid social categories related to occupation and wealth, rather than fixed ethnic identities. The Belgians, influenced by racial theories, instituted ethnic ID cards, preferential treatment for Tutsis, and divide-and-rule policies. The genocide stemmed from modern political manipulation, not ancient tribal hatred. Yet Western media frames it otherwise. The harm is substantial. If we think conflicts are tribal, We don't look for real causes. Resource competition driven by climate change, political marginalization, deliberate manipulation of ethnic identities by elites seeking power. It reinforces stereotypes of African irrationality and makes conflicts seem unsolvable. If they're rooted in ancient hatred, what can you do? And critically, the tribal framework obscures Western complicity through colonialism, arms sales, resource extraction, and exploitative economic policies. The West becomes a potential savior rather than a participant in creating the conditions for conflict. Now, this brings us to one of the most pervasive and emotionally manipulative patterns in how Africa is represented, what's been termed poverty porn, and its close companion, the white savior complex. The term poverty porn was coined in 1981 by Jorgen Listner to describe campaigns that put people's bodies, their misery, their grief, and their fear on display, with all the details and all the indiscretion that a telescopic lens will allow. If you grew up in the West, particularly from the 1980s onward, you've been exposed to countless charity advertisements featuring emaciated children, distended bellies, flies on faces, mud huts, overlaid with melancholic music, telling you that for a small monthly donation, you can save these helpless people. These images are constructed. I don't mean they're fake, the suffering is real, but they're carefully selected and framed to evoke maximum emotional response. They present subjects without agency, dignity, or context. You never learn names, stories, or circumstances. They're reduced to visual symbols of suffering. This representation serves specific purposes. It's effective for fundraising. Studies consistently show these images generate more donations than dignified representations. But it has consequences. It reduces complex political and economic situations to individual suffering requiring charity rather than systemic change. It positions Africans as helpless victims needing Western rescue rather than people with agency navigating difficult circumstances. And it erases local organizations, activists, and movements already doing work. The white savior becomes necessary. The white savior narrative is everywhere. A young Western person goes to Africa, teaches at a school or builds a well, and returns transformed by the experience of helping those people. Their personal growth becomes the story, while Africans remain backdrop to Western self-discovery. Consider the volunteer tourism industry. Thousands pay to volunteer in African countries despite lacking qualifications. Organizations profit from this model even when short-term, unskilled volunteers provide little benefit, sometimes harm, to communities. The point isn't impact, but the volunteers' experience and feeling of having helped. Film and literature perpetuate this. Movies like The Last King of Scotland, Blood Diamond, and The Constant Gardener center white protagonists in African settings. Even films ostensibly about African issues, like The Help or Green Book for Black American Stories, center white perspectives and white moral journeys. African characters exist to facilitate white character development. This isn't about individual volunteers or filmmakers being bad people. It's about a structural pattern, making certain stories intelligible and marketable while others aren't. Stories centering African agency, African problem-solving, African complexity don't fit the framework media outlets and audiences expect. The consequences are real. Research shows exposure to poverty porn decreases support for systemic solutions and increases support for charity-based approaches. It affects policy, If problems are framed as individual suffering rather than structural issues, solutions become aid and charity rather than trade justice, debt cancellation, or reparations. And it affects how Africans are viewed globally, as perpetual recipients of help rather than political and economic actors. Closely related to this is how media coverage focuses overwhelmingly on crises while ignoring everything else. Researchers quantified this. A 2019 study by Africa No Filter analyzed international news coverage of Africa across 80,000 articles. War, poverty, disease, and corruption dominated. Stories about innovation, entrepreneurship, arts, culture, and ordinary life were rare. Africa gets covered when things go wrong, not when things go right, or just exist normally. During the 2014 U.S.-Africa Leaders Summit, a historic meeting resulting in billions in investment pledges, Western media focused on the Ebola outbreak. Ebola appeared in coverage more than U.S. and Summit combined, despite Ebola affecting only a few countries represented. This creates several effects. Africa receives less international coverage than any continent despite 1.5 billion people. When coverage occurs, it's concentrated on negatives: wars, famines, disease, disasters, coups. Positive developments, cultural achievements, economic progress are systematically ignored. This creates the myth of timeless present, that Africa is perpetually in crisis. Crisis news also erases context. Famine stories focus on immediate crisis, starving children, humanitarian need, but rarely explain historical factors. Did colonial land policies disrupt agriculture? Did structural adjustment programs undermine food security? Did climate change affect farmers? These don't fit crisis format. Well, beyond these patterns of poverty porn and crisis coverage, we need to examine something even older and more deeply embedded: the cultural stereotypes that frame how Africa and Africans are understood. These aren't just modern media constructions. They're colonial ideologies that never fully went away. The persistent image of Africa as primitive, backward, and unchanging has deep roots in how European colonizers justified their domination. If Africans were civilized equals, colonialism couldn't be defended. So colonial ideology constructed Africans as fundamentally different, lacking civilization, technology, complex political systems, and history. This ideology required erasing evidence contradicting it. When Europeans encountered sophisticated African civilizations, Great Zimbabwe, the Kingdom of Congo, the Songhai Empire, Timbuktu as a center of learning, they struggled to reconcile this with their ideology. Often, they attributed these achievements to external influences. Great Zimbabwe's stone structures were attributed to Phoenicians or Arabs, anyone except the Africans who actually built them. This erasure continues in how African history is taught, or rather, not taught, in Western education systems. The primitive narrative manifests in countless ways. African religions are called tribal beliefs or superstitions, while European religions are faith. African governance systems are tribal, while European ones are nations. African music and art are folklore, while European equivalents are culture. The vocabulary itself encodes a hierarchy. This extends to representation of African bodies. During colonialism, Africans were literally displayed in human zoos and exhibitions as exotic curiosities. While those explicit displays ended, the objectification continues. Fashion magazines and advertisements frequently use Africa as exotic backdrop. Models posed with African children, wildlife, or tribal settings. The message: Africa exists for Western consumption and aesthetic pleasure. Contemporary examples abound. In 2017, a Dove ad showed a black woman removing her shirt to reveal a white woman, implying transformation from dirty to clean. H&M featured a black child in a hoodie reading, "Coolest monkey in the jungle." These weren't isolated incidents, but patterns revealing how deeply these associations are embedded. The technology myth is particularly revealing. There's a persistent assumption that Africa lacks technology, innovation, and modern infrastructure. This assumption is so ingrained that evidence contradicting it is treated as surprising or remarkable. Kenya's M-Pesa mobile money system revolutionized banking, with over 40 million users transferring billions in a country where traditional banking infrastructure was limited. It's a major fintech innovation studied globally. Yet Western coverage often treats it as a curiosity. Look what Africa can do, rather than recognizing Kenya as a leader in financial technology. Similar patterns occur with other innovations. Nigeria's Nollywood produces over 2,000 films annually, making it the world's second-largest film industry. Ghana became the first African country to connect to the internet in 1993. Rwanda's tech sector is growing rapidly, with the government investing heavily in digital infrastructure. South Africa leads in biotechnology and renewable energy innovation. These aren't framed as technology stories, but as Africa's technology stories, marked as exceptional rather than normal. When Silicon Valley produces innovation, it's just news. When Africa does, it's surprising, requiring explanation. This ties to how infrastructure is represented. Images of Africa overwhelmingly show rural villages, mud huts, and unpaved roads. Urban Africa, Lagos, Nairobi, Johannesburg, Cairo, with modern architecture, highways, and tech hubs, is invisible. When shown, it's framed as exceptional rather than representative of significant portions of African life. The wildlife obsession is another distinctive pattern. When Western media represents Africa visually, it's disproportionately through wildlife. Lions, elephants, giraffes, safari landscapes. These images are beautiful, but they crowd out representations of actual African life. This has colonial roots. Europeans constructed Africa as nature, wild, untamed, primitive, in contrast to Europe as civilization. Safari tourism emerged from this, allowing wealthy Westerners to experience wild Africa. This framework persists. Consider how African countries are branded internationally. Tourism campaigns often center wildlife rather than culture, history, or modern attractions. This makes economic sense. It matches what Western tourists expect, but it reinforces the idea that Africa's value lies in its wildness, rather than its people, cultures, and achievements. The environmental conservation narrative often excludes or marginalizes African voices. Conservation is frequently framed as Western environmentalists saving African wildlife from Africans, poachers, developers, or simply people living their lives. This ignores that many indigenous communities practiced sustainable management for centuries, and that contemporary conservation challenges often stem from colonial disruption of these systems. Conservation efforts sometimes harm local communities. People are displaced from ancestral lands to create parks and reserves. They're excluded from resources they traditionally used. Yet Western media typically frames this as necessary sacrifice for the greater good, with Africans positioned as obstacles to conservation rather than stakeholders in their own environments. So beyond individual stories and stereotypes, there are structural factors in how news is produced that systematically bias coverage. Most major outlets have one Africa correspondent for the entire continent, despite Africa being larger than China, USA, India, and Europe combined, with 54 countries. No outlet has a single Europe correspondent covering Iceland to Greece. This structural setup means correspondents can't develop deep expertise, parachute into crises without context, and rely on official sources rather than local journalists. The Africa No-Filter Global Media Index analyzed over 1,000 articles from 20 major outlets. The Guardian, AFP, and Al Jazeera ranked highest. The New York Times, Washington Post, and Wall Street Journal ranked in the bottom 3. The problem isn't individual prejudice, but systemic. How organizations are structured, allocate resources, define newsworthiness, and what narrative frameworks they use. There's also the question of who tells the stories. Most reporting on Africa in major Western outlets is by Western journalists. African journalists are quoted as sources, but rarely byline major stories. This matters because it affects what's considered newsworthy, what context is provided, and what assumptions go unquestioned. When Western journalists do engage African voices, it's often in specific ways. Ordinary Africans are quoted for human interest and color. How does the situation feel? African experts and officials are quoted less frequently than Western experts, even when discussing African issues. This positions Western voices as analytical authorities and African voices as experiential subjects. The language used in coverage also reveals bias. African leaders are described with more negative terminology than Western leaders, even when behaviors are similar. Corruption stories about African officials get more prominent coverage than comparable Western corruption. Elections in African countries are described as chaotic or disputed more readily than similar situations elsewhere. All of this brings us to a crucial question. We've examined geographic homogenization, poverty porn, cultural stereotypes, wildlife obsession, technology myths, and structural bias. But why do these patterns persist 60 years after decolonization? Because they serve functions. They're useful. For news organizations, crisis news is economically rational. Dramatic stories drive engagement. Familiar narratives allow quick, cheap coverage that meets audience expectations. For charities, poverty porn raises more money than dignified representations. The emotional manipulation works because it taps existing stereotypes and lets donors feel like saviors. For Western political and economic elites, these misconceptions justify particular policies. If Africa is perpetually in crisis due to endemic problems, Western intervention seems necessary. Historical context of colonialism and structural inequalities can be backgrounded. Instead of conversations about reparations, trade justice, or debt cancellation, we get conversations about aid and charity. For international institutions like the World Bank and IMF, these reinforce their importance. If African countries can't manage their own affairs, they need guidance from international technocrats, legitimizing policy conditions and structural adjustment that align with wealthy countries' interests. For Western audiences, these provide emotional comfort. They allow feeling better about inequality by positioning it as natural, Africans are backward, or fixable through charity, donations will save children, rather than requiring systemic change or acknowledging complicity. This is what Edward Said called Orientalism, constructing the other as fundamentally different and inferior to define and elevate the West by contrast. Just as colonial ideology constructed Africans as primitive to justify domination, contemporary representations construct Africa as perpetually in crisis in ways reinforcing existing hierarchies. Critically, these misconceptions actively harm Africans. They shape investment decisions, limiting capital flows. They shape policies at international institutions, leading to interventions ignoring local expertise. They shape migration policies. They shape education, with children growing up with distorted understandings. And they affect how Africans see themselves. Research shows even African journalists have internalized and reproduced some stereotypes. So, what do we do? First, recognize these patterns exist and develop critical media literacy. When encountering representations of Africa, ask, what's shown and what's not? Whose voices are centered? What historical context is provided or erased? What stereotypes are activated? What power relationships does this reinforce? Second, actively seek out African voices, African media, African creators telling their own stories. With the internet, this is possible. Follow African journalists. Watch films by African directors. Read African authors. Support platforms like Africa No Filter, working to shift narratives. The counter to Chimamanda Adichie's single story is seeking multiple complex stories told by those who live these realities. Third, recognize changing these patterns requires structural change. News organizations need to rethink coverage and resource allocation. Charities need to move away from poverty porn, even if short-term fundraising suffers. Educational systems need to actually teach African history and contemporary realities. Fourth, understand this isn't just about representation. It's about justice. How Africa is represented has real material consequences. It shapes economic relationships, political policies, power structures. Changing representations is part of addressing global inequality and colonial legacies. Finally, recognizing these problems doesn't mean ignoring real challenges. The critique isn't that we shouldn't acknowledge poverty or report crises. It's about how stories are told, who tells them, what context is provided, what's centered and erased, and what narratives are reinforced or challenged. Africa is a vast, diverse continent of 1.5 billion people in 54 countries with thousands of cultures and languages. It contains ancient civilizations and modern megacities, traditional practices and cutting-edge innovation, poverty and wealth, conflict and peace, challenges and achievements, the full range of human experience. Representing that accurately is difficult but necessary. Recognizing how thoroughly media has failed is the first step toward doing better. The patterns we've discussed aren't random. They're systematic, have historical roots, and serve contemporary purposes. Breaking them requires not just good intentions, but structural change and sustained critical engagement. It requires questioning our assumptions, seeking different voices, and recognizing the single story about Africa is fundamentally misleading in ways that matter. Anyway, that's what I wanted to share. I'm sure many of you have thoughts and experiences on this, particularly those from African countries who've experienced these representations firsthand. I hope you'll share in the comments. This is one perspective on a vast topic, and it's a conversation needing many voices. Thanks for watching. If you found this useful, share it with others. And until next time, stay curious, stay critical, and keep questioning the stories we're told about the world.